Well, hello, coaches. As always, I am so happy to see you. Tonight, we're going to be talking about bridging the gap, overcoming bias to connect and create clients. I'm Gretchen Hydo. This is First Wednesdays. First Wednesdays is going to be recorded. It'll be publicly uploaded to my YouTube channel and it will not be edited. So if you don't want your face or voice to be seen or heard, you can turn off your camera and turn off your microphone and just maybe private chat me so I don't say things like unmute, turn on your camera and put you on the spot. Really, really glad that you're here. Tonight we have Joel with us, and Joel's a friend for one thing, but Joel Perez is also a seasoned coach. He's a speaker, he's an author, and he has a deep expertise in career transitions, leadership, and cultural humility. He has a book called Dear White Leader: How to Achieve Organizational Excellence Through Cultural Humility, and he challenges leaders to expand their awareness to drive meaningful change. The reason that I wanted to bring Joel in is because he's talking about a really important topic. And the thing that I like about this is that as coaches, we all know that creating real connections with our clients is essential to having clients and to having a robust roster. And that some of the small things like assumptions, biases, sometimes even like unintentionally pushing a potential client in a way that might go against who they are can be a barrier, and we don't even know that we're doing it. And Joel is someone that has been in some of my programs. I've had the pleasure of coaching him. We're on a board together. Our lives have intersected in many ways, and there has been so much that I have learned from him about even small microaggressions that can get in the way to true client connection. And so tonight, what we're going to do is he's going to help us to really take a look at some of the blind spots that are there, and he's going to help us to see how those blind spots can actually be turned into spotlights for connection rather than barriers. And so, with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Joel. I'll be here managing your chat for you if you need it, and take it away. And thank you for coming.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you, Gretchen, for inviting me to be part of First Wednesday. And I know some of you. I don't know all of you, but it's good to meet you and to be here with you. And yeah, we're gonna crank through this. There are some slides just to help guide. But if you feel free like to pop in if you need to, if you have a question. Um, by the way, I just want to acknowledge that I'm on a journey just like all of you, and I still make mistakes with clients as well as kids that I'm raising who identify as bisexual and gender fluid, as well as colleagues. And so just know that, yes, I spend time thinking about these things. I think about them regularly. There are still times where I mess up. And so we'll talk a little bit about those experiences and how to recover from them, particularly in a coaching environment, as well as when you're speaking and or individually with folks more one-on-one. But well, I'm going to share my screen. So I am going. Gretchen, if you can manage the chat, and if you see something that you feel like I need to address, jump
Definitely.
in. And so, because I won't be seeing the chat as I work through these, but I thought I would start with the story. And so it's a Wednesday morning, and I log on to Zoom, and I am working with a client. His name is Tim. Tim is a senior leader at an organization. He identifies as white male, and he is sharing with me some frustration with with a direct report who he's finding challenging, who happens to identify as African American, Black, younger professional. Tim is seasoned, and trying to navigate what it means leading a diverse team. And he says, "Hey Joel, I really appreciate this cultural humility stuff, but how do I put it into action and work with my client, with my direct reports?" And I said, "Okay, well, what's happening?" He said, "Well, I have this direct report who keeps challenging me in how change is not happening as fast as it should in our organization. And I said, okay, so what exactly are they presenting to you? And Tim proceeds to share with me that they feel the organization is not moving fast enough, change isn't happening quick enough, there's too much resistance. And I said, Tim, have you thought about asking them, what does change look like for you at this time? And so so we coach around that, and because the natural inclination is for Tim to just be really directive and say, "Well, just tell me what you want." And I said, "Well, that's not really helpful, particularly if you're working with someone who identifies from a minoritized community, because they will feel like you're accusing them of something and you're not open to change." And so all that to say is Tim put that into practice, and he came back to report that they had a very meaningful conversation, and he acknowledged that as a white male in that space, he has privilege that he didn't always recognize until we started coaching. So why is that story important here? Well, one, by the way, I must acknowledge that I identify as Chicano Latino, cisgender male, and that, like I said, still have struggles. But I enter spaces acknowledging my identity in those spaces. And so Tim knew that about me, and I wasn't afraid to share it up front. And so we had a great coaching relationship, and he began to change the way he led his organization. And I think as a coach, I need to acknowledge one, my own identity and lean into it as a strength, and also acknowledge and or create space for others who have different identities than myself, that they can feel like they can be themselves in that space and ask questions. So having this posture of cultural humility where you're willing to acknowledge that you still have a lot to learn and that you're going to make mistakes along the way, I believe is a posture that can help you as a coach think about how you engage with coaching clients who may have a different identity than you, as well as create space for folks that may find that whole topic challenging to be able to ask questions of you, even if you identify as someone from a minoritized community or a non-dominant cultural group. So I think it's important just for us to start there, because I think it's just something for us to reflect on. And you might already start thinking about who in my sphere, who do I work with, who do I coach, who maybe have different identities than mine, that I need to be just more cognizant of, but also more cognizant about my own identities and how they show up in the coaching space. So why might this topic be of interest to you? Well, you want to serve your clients better. You want to create an inclusive coaching space, and you want clients from either minoritized communities that feel like they can come to you because you want to work with them in a genuine, authentic way, and you want to serve, right? If any of you've worked with Gretchen and or other, well, with Gretchen in particular, you will know that she says it's all about serving. It's all about being in service. And so that's the posture you need to have, whether you're a coach or a leader. I believe, as Gretchen believes, that you need to be of service, that you need to just know that you're there to serve your clients, and that that is going to be helpful in creating a space where it has that sense of belonging and that psychological safety that you want to create for your clients, and to attract clients who will feel that way and know that about you as they reach out to you. I think it's important to also note that what I'm trying to do in the work that I do is create or help people become exceptional in what they do. And in this case, I want you all to walk away with some things to think about at how you can become an exceptional coach. We have enough effective coaches, and effective coaches focus on achieving specific goals and solving immediate issues, which are important. But if you really want to leave that lasting legacy and impression, you need to be exceptional coaches, meaning you need to go beyond helping your clients just complete tasks towards moving towards transformation of their mindsets, habits, and your own approach so that you can inspire profound personal and professional growth that lasts beyond a 6-month coaching engagement or a 12-month coaching engagement. You want to leave a lasting impression. So I want to share a little bit about the barriers that particularly from folks from minoritized communities may face, and some of these may be your clients, and I know some of you identify as someone from minoritized community, which you may relate and these may resonate with you, but your clients may be coming to you having experienced stereotype threat, which is something that occurs when people that are members of a group fear that their behaviors may contribute to a stereotype about their social group. And they're feeling this way at work, or they've experienced racism in their workplace, or with colleagues, or in their faith communities. And so, and they've had these experiences, or they may be experiencing microaggressions at work, which we'll do a deeper dive in, or some level of bias. And I want to note a recent study, although it's not as recent anymore, by Okoya and Passmore, who do a lot of research on coaching. And they worked with particularly Black academics in England and the US and the barriers that they experience. And they share in their study what organizations can do. And what I believe as coaches, we need to be aware of that these barriers exist with clients, particularly those from minoritized communities. Okay. And it's important for us to recognize the things. So when a client comes to us, one, also, I'm going to say this right now, do not assume anything about your client. We need to check our biases at the door. So one of the questions that I always ask myself before I walk into a coaching session is, what bias do I need to check today? Take that 5-minute, 10-minute break between a session and just ask yourself, what biases do I need to check that may be present as I think about working with this client? So in my case, if I'm working with a white male, someone who identifies as a white male, I may have a bias about how I think white men have a lot of privilege and maybe feel like they have entitlement. And that's a particular bias that I've grown over time that I need to check myself on, because it impacts the way I show up in the coaching space, right? I want to serve, so that means being as best as you can a clean slate, so that you can ask questions that are going to be deep and with deep curiosity, so that you can hear their story without your biases getting wrapped up or influencing the way what you think about them before you even start asking questions. And I think that's really important for us as coaches, because if we don't do a good job of that, we're going to get a reputation, we're not going to be of service, and it's going to impact us in the long run. Okay. So how many of you, and you could drop this in the chat, how many of you were familiar with the term cultural humility, either before today or at all? How many of you are familiar with that term? So if you just want to drop in the chat before you heard about my book. So,
Diana says that yes, she's familiar.
okay.
Rebecca's familiar.
Okay. Others, how many of you are
Jenna
familiar?
is familiar.
Okay.
I was not familiar.
Okay.
Brian,
Those,
Brian says not that term specifically. Savory says she is not familiar.
okay. For those of you that were familiar with the term, what was the context that you became aware of the term? So what was the context? Jen, I will get to your question.
Okay, you can see it.
Yeah. So those of you that are familiar with the term, what was the context that you became familiar with it? DEI workshop, thank you. All right. Generally, when I ask this question, when I'm in spaces with well, just in general, generally when people are that say they're familiar with the term are people who have some experience with the healthcare profession or the helping professions. Cultural humility gets talked a lot about. Social work degree, yes. Anyone generally in the helping professions has heard of the term cultural humility. The term was coined or developed by two folks in the helping profession, Trevelyan and Garcia, who were frustrated with doctors approaching their patients with the same approach that they had developed with one cultural group. They just felt it applied for all cultural groups. And the danger in that, of course, as you can imagine, is that what works for one group may not work for all groups. And they weren't being curious, and they weren't really acknowledging that different cultural groups have different experiences, particularly with healthcare. So they developed the term cultural humility. And the way I talk about cultural humility is that it's a posture that can help leaders lead exceptionally in the areas of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and navigate that complexity that comes with leading those efforts. And it's the same with coaches. We need, if we want to create that space where our clients feel like they can be themselves, have that sense of belonging, the psychological safety, we need to develop this posture of cultural humility. So there are three aspects of cultural humility. The internal, which is the self-awareness and self-critique, and that's what we're going to really talk about today. The external, or redressing or addressing power imbalances, and then ultimately changing organizations. Those are the three characteristics that comprise cultural humility. The first one is that self-awareness and self-critique, right? Because it starts with you. I'm sure many of you, as you coach or have been coached, a lot of the self-awareness stuff starts popping up. If we want to be better at what we do, we have to recognize who we are and how we're wired, so we know where the gaps exist in order for us to get better, right? And so there are three aspects of developing self-awareness and self-critique. The first is bias, which we'll talk about. Cultural self-awareness, of getting clear about who you are, how you're wired from a cultural perspective, and developing other awareness. Developing the awareness of those folks around us so that we can better understand their story. And this is extremely important when it comes to coaching, right? We want to be able to get to know our clients in a way that's going to help them and serve them so they can be better leaders or address the challenges that they're presenting to you as their coach. So let's talk about bias. The reality is that we all have bias. I was doing a webinar for the Institute of Coaching, which is a fairly large coaching organization, and I was talking about bias, particularly as it relates to cultural humility. And someone asked the question, can we ever eradicate bias? The simple answer is no. Why? Because our brains are wired for bias, meaning we want to be able to make quick decisions, snap decisions, and that's when bias can start creeping in because we've allowed our experiences historically or whatever to influence the way we think about people or places so that we can make decisions quickly. And that's when bias can start creep in because we're not being curious, we're not remaining curious or challenging our assumptions. We allow assumptions to take deep root in us, and that can be a bad thing, particularly as we coach, like I said, of working with our clients. If we're not careful, we can let bias creep in and really impact the way we coach because we're automatically making assumptions. So we need to detach ourselves from our assumptions, our biases, and our certainty, is how I talk about it. All right. And as Jennifer Brown says, who wrote the book, How to Be an Inclusive Leader, bias can be so deeply entrenched that it can prevent other identity groups from finding a seat at the table. Why is this important as a coach? Well, if you're working with clients from minoritized communities, this is most likely impacting their experience in their organizations or the challenges that they may be having. So when I'm working with the client who may not have shared their identities with me, and I'm noticing some things that are happening with them that they're presenting, I may say, hey, Gretchen, it appears to me that what I'm observing is that maybe your experience as a woman in this organization is having an impact on the way you're being perceived. Is that the case? Now, if Gretchen says, absolutely not, I don't want to talk about it, my role is got you, move on. Okay. But if Gretchen says, Joel, actually, you're right. Like, I'm glad you noticed that. I need to figure out what do I do about that? How do I show up to be, I want to be seen as a strong leader in this organization, but it's very patriarchal and I'm not being given space to be who I want to be. That's different, right? And so then I figure out how to help Gretchen be the leader she wants to be in the organization in the midst of the biases that she's experiencing, right? And it could be more of a leadership conversation or a career coaching conversation, because maybe Gretchen feels like, identifies that this isn't the best organization for her and she needs to move on and find something else, right? So it's important that we recognize and acknowledge and affirm identities, but only if people want to explore them. Okay. I'm going to pause there and see if there's any questions or anything that people want to bring up as I've shared that with you all. Any thoughts,
I just have
testimonies?
a question about some terminology that I'm hearing you say. You're
Yeah.
referring, I wrote it down, um, minoritized communities
Yeah.
as opposed to like a minority group. So can you
Yeah.
help me understand the choice of words?
Yeah, so minoritized I believe, is more reflective of communities that are underrepresented, meaning that we have been minoritized as a group. We have been given that label. And so it could be someone who identifies as female, someone who identifies as, like I do, Chicano Latino, someone who identifies as part of the LGBTQ community. We've been minoritized in the way we experience organizations and or society. And that's where I'm coming. That's why I use the term minoritized. That help, Jen?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Now you've asked the question, Jen, too, and I want to address it because you asked about cultural competency versus cultural humility. Cultural competency is extremely important and it is the foundation. When I do these cultural humility workshops, I really do acknowledge that cultural competency is important. But in my experience, as I was growing up or becoming, more seasoned, I always felt that cultural competency felt like something to be achieved. It was, for me, it felt like a box to check, a certificate to earn, a book to read. And it always felt like there had to be more, because what works when I got trained 10 years ago isn't working anymore. So what I learned about different ethnic groups 10, 20 years ago isn't really helpful anymore because society has changed. And I relate that to the story in my book about my 17-year-old coming out to us. And now we're talking about gender pronouns and how they're experiencing the world. So what I learned 15 years ago isn't being as helpful, although a strong foundation. So that cultural humility allows you to navigate that complexity. Whereas I feel that cultural competency, although very important, is not, there's more to that because society will continue to change and morph. So that's why I talk about cultural humility being, cultural competency being the foundation, but that we need to develop more of ourselves in order to navigate that complexity, particularly as it comes with working with clients from different groups or different minoritized communities. Right. So I'll talk about microaggressions.
So,
Or before I go there, any more questions or anything else? Yeah, go ahead, Diane.
yeah. The thing about competency, do you find that a cultural competency allows for a level of disingenuousness in a way that cultural humility doesn't?
Yeah, I can see that. Yes, it allows for, I went there, I got a certificate. I know what I'm talking about. Culture humility, that's that lifelong learning process, that deep process of self-awareness that comes with some level of cultural competency. But again, as we continue to grow, we continue to become aware of things that are problematic for us, right? I talk about, funny story for me, I used to have a lot more hair than I do now. I had to come to a realization that I was growing bald, right? And I just at some point owned it, right? I became self-aware enough to say, this is the reality of it for me. I need to just go ahead and take my hair off, right? Now, my kids make fun of me now because when I say I'm going to go get my hair cut, they're like, Dad, you have no hair. What are you talking about? So yes, I'm getting my head shaved. But I didn't like knowing that about myself, but I knew I needed to just acknowledge it so that I can move on from a personally, right? And I always relate doing this work around cultural humility as a leadership component because, or related to leadership development, because those of you who work with leaders and are leaders know that if you want to become a better leader, you got to get clear about who you are. And if you're able to become clear of who you are, you know where you need to go. Right. And so those of you who work with senior leaders or executives know those that are really self-aware and those that are not. And I wager to say those that are really self-aware are probably the ones that are the most successful or are able to grow and develop themselves as a leader to be successful people, right? Compared to those that are not. All right, let's talk about microaggressions because I want to make sure I allow time because I think this is an important topic. So microaggressions refer to that subtle, often unintentional comment or action that can be perceived as discriminatory or dismissive towards someone based on their race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, disability, or other marginalized identity. Behaviors or remarks might seem small or insignificant on the surface, but they accumulate over time and can negatively affect the well-being and self-esteem of the person targeted. Okay. We have probably experienced some of this either directed at us or seen it directed at others, right? And over time, even though initially it may not seem that big of a deal, can take a huge toll, particularly those of us from minoritized communities, where it can impact our psychological and well-being as well as our physical well-being, right? If we're always showing up to work or being present when this is happening, it takes a toll. So some of us, like I said, at times I've committed a microaggression, sometimes with my children, particularly around their sexual identities, and or when I work with clients from a different group or identity than myself, I have stuck my foot in my mouth, and I recognize that, right? And this may happen to you in your coaching engagement. So what do you do? What do you do when that happens? Well, there's a process that I think is really important for us to consider, right? And the first is one, acknowledge that it happened to ourselves now, and whether that's internally or inwardly or outwardly, take the time to reflect. Could be 5 seconds, could be 10 seconds, right? And then apologize. Okay. And this is where the apology can be tricky. All right. Why can it be tricky? Well, because there are two types of apologies. There's the imposing apology, which could mean taking too long to act, acting from a place of defensiveness and making excuses, making it about us, why we said what we said. No, I didn't mean that. I'm sorry. That's not what I intended. But the impact was there, right? And so we have probably may have either committed an imposing apology or experienced an imposing apology, right? We want, or I would like for you all to learn about the empowering apology, where we seek to empower the targeted individual. I'm really sorry, Gretchen, that I said that. Sorry, I said that. Stop. It's not about me. It's about what happened. And I've acknowledged it and I've apologized. And I don't expect Gretchen to respond. You could also say, Gretchen, I'm sorry that happened. No need to respond. If you're open to it, I may want to come back and really talk about what happened so I can get better at this and just walk away. Okay. See the difference? Now, what I have seen happen or I've committed myself is, oh, Gretchen, I am so sorry. That's really not what I meant. I think you misunderstood me. Can you yeah, it wasn't really that big of a deal, you know, so I've done it with so and so and they didn't think it was a big deal. Um, and see, the focus is on me, right? I need to make myself feel better about it, right? So if you ever find yourself in a situation where you recognize that, hey, I messed up, or someone points it out to you, say, wow, I'm so sorry, and just stop. Now, the person could say, well, I want you to, you know, I want you to learn. Here, really share with you what happened. Or they could just, you know, walk away, and you need to learn how to let it go. And that's hard. I get it.
And you
Right?
know, I will jump in here, Joel. I had something happen around COVID. We're a few years past COVID at this point, and I had a client who is still so afraid of COVID, and I am so over being afraid of COVID. And in coaching, there was something that came up about where he would or maybe wouldn't go. And I dismissed it. I dismissed it. I didn't mean to dismiss it, but I dismissed it. And in that moment, I could feel his energy shift. And he
Mhm.
said, I feel dismissed. And I said, you know what? You're right. And I am so sorry about that. And then I had to just be quiet and not say, well, but I'm over COVID and you should be over COVID. It was just, you're right, because I had dismissed it.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So yeah, if the other person doesn't point it out, right, and you may like, but you maybe feel a little awkward about what you said, and you may recognize, oh, there, that just didn't sit right with me. Hey, Gretchen, I think I said something that was not, you know, was biased, or was biased in some way, or was, I would, you know, think of it as a microaggression. I just want to apologize for it. Now, Gretchen could say, hey, Joel, nope, you're good. That's it, right? But if you feel uncomfortable enough, now, what I when I work with clients, particularly those from minoritized communities, is I ask them, do you feel like, if it's really bothering them, like if this something happened with Gretchen at work, and she's coming to me and she's sharing it with me, I will say, hey, Gretchen, this seems to be really bothering you. Do you want to address it? And Gretchen could say yes, so that I coach around that. But Gretchen could say, I don't feel safe. Like I report to them. I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job. And I say, okay, I just want to make sure that you feel like you have the support you need, and we could process it together, right? But Gretchen may decide, I need to just not say anything. And that, unfortunately, those of you who work with clients may experience that, where they may not feel like they have the psychological safety or the sense of belonging where they can bring it up. So then it's coaching around how you can help them find the support they need to either keep working there, or to file a complaint, or to figure out something else. Right. All right, Brian, let's see. I'm curious as to what you do as a coach when your client exhibits bias, or does not, or doesn't microaggression in the session towards you. Well, this is where I think you got to, you know, kind of get the lay of the land, or kind of feel it out, right? You could say, hey, Brian, you know, I want to just share something with you, because I think it's important, right? At the beginning, we talked about we're going to be honest, and we're going to be transparent, and I want to share something with you. I think it's important because I want to help you be the best leader that you can be. So what you just said, actually was offensive, and I need to name it. Um, Now, if Brian says, they could say, "Oh," and they get defensive, and you could say, Brian could say, "Oh, what? You don't need to get defensive. I just want to point it out to you so that it doesn't happen again." That's it, right? Now, again, you have to feel confident, and feel like you have the ability to do that. If you don't, then that's a different kind of conversation. But if you do, I would say, if you have that session up front, right? That, as when Gretchen says, we have that first session, you take time to really lay out the ground rules of the coaching engagement, where you lay out, hey, I'm going to challenge you, right? I'm going to interrupt you, or I'm going to do this. I want to make sure we're clear about the rules of engagement as a coach, so that if I have to bring something up, I'm going to bring something up. Okay. I don't know, Brian, does that get a little bit at what you were asking?
Yeah, I think what the takeaway from it is you really get in the agreement on the front end of the whole coaching arrangement, what your
Yeah.
role is and how
Hmm.
you serve. And it may
Hmm.
be in a way that sometimes they're not comfortable with. However, I think you just have to get that agreement that they're okay
Yeah.
with it. And then you can
Yeah.
reference it back. Remember
Hmm.
when we discussed this? This is an
Yes.
example.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah. And um, coaches have coaches, right? And so this is where either having a mentor coach or having a coach supervisor, to being a coach supervision, engagement to really talk through with other coaches. How do I handle this if I got, I'm coaching a CEO and it's clearly a problem, but I don't know if I could, how do I bring this up? And this is where having a coaching community around you can help you strategize on how to do that work. All right. Any other questions around microaggressions? Okay. So what's the impact? Well, it impacts you, right? You're going to be, I think you're going to be a better coach. One, to recognize your biases and to have a plan if microaggressions happen, as well as helping your clients have a plan or help your clients through this process is going to have an impact on you as a coach and ultimately your business because you're going to get a reputation of being really good at acknowledging people's identities, right? And so you're going to attract and you have this posture of serving and you do it in a really genuine and authentic way. All right. So I'm going to end with this and then I'm just going to open it up for questions as well as share some other things and resources with you all. So what's it going to take to build a posture of cultural humility? And these three things are really things that we as coaches do anyway, but we have to really lean into them as we think about being better at navigating that complexity. The first is having a growth mindset. We need to be recognize that we're going to make mistakes, and it's not about shutting down after we make mistakes, but learning how to grow from those mistakes. Right? The second is developing deep curiosity just like a kid. And we as coaches are trained to be curious, right? Those powerful questions. We have to really lean into that as we develop this posture of cultural humility, because we're going to have a lot to learn and we're going to make mistakes either with our clients or with ourselves, but we have to remain curious in those moments. We have to learn how to develop or learn to develop deep listen, the ability to deeply listen. Okay. Even as coaches, we struggle with this. We say we're better we say we're better listeners than we actually are, right? So what are you doing to create space in the coaching environment or the coaching container in order to listen, but also to develop yourself as a listener? So breathing, learning how to breathe, mindfulness exercises before you walk into the coaching engagement. So you're a better listener is going to be really important. But ultimately, it really starts with you as the coach. But it doesn't end with you. And it doesn't end with you, and you're not in this alone, right? So let me share a story with you about the redwood trees. I don't know how many of you have seen a redwood tree. My guess is some of you have. Um, and so, yes, Dana, very much so. LOL on that. Uh, I always thought redwood trees had deep roots. They don't. Their roots grow outward. And the way they're able to withstand strong winds and storms is their roots intertwine with other roots around them. So they work together. You have to do this work in community. All right. And it's not a straight path. It is twisty and just like roots, they grow all twisty and there's all kinds of stuff that happens, right? But you're in this together and you're doing it with other people. You cannot do this work in isolation. One thing I've learned about my involvement with ICF LA, the International Coaching Federation LA, and other organizations, other professional organizations, is that I am in it with other people. And I need other people that I can lean on and learn from. And that's going to take you farther than if you just try to do it by yourself. You have to do it in community. And as a reminder, we need exceptional coaches, not just effective coaches. So if you're going to be that exceptional coach, cultural humility and the ability to coach with that posture is going to get you there. All right. So be curious, not judgmental. I'm a big Ted Lasso fan. Practice curiosity. Here's some way to contact me. Gretchen's going to drop it in the chat too. The book is available if you want to take a deeper dive. Each chapter ends with exercises to be reflective. The QR code is for a workbook that I've created to help people develop a posture of cultural humility. If you go to the QR code, you sign up, give me your email address, I will send you the workbook. You'll get it. So you have it. And then the website at Boyle for Coaches is, I just telling Gretchen earlier, I launched a new side of my business, which is coaching for coaches. And so I will be providing 2 workshops later this year for continuing coaching education. That'll range from 12 to 16 CCEs. One is going to do a deeper dive on this bias and microaggressions and cultural self-awareness. And so the information, just so you all know, the one I was referring to will be both of those courses are $500, and you'll, like I said, you'll get 12 to 14 CCEs. If you sign up for the workbook, I will let you know when the registration goes live. So if you need CCEs, as well as just professional development, this is a way to get a hold of me as well. So what questions or what wonderings do any of you have about the stuff we were covering? How are you all thinking about, and one of you can answer, or all of you, how are you all thinking about how this plays out in your current practice?
Brian, I saw that you had unmuted maybe for the first question if you want to tackle that.
Oh, I had a question. So,
Okay, please.
I think the question is, when we talk about culture or identity of individuals, it can get into therapy very quickly in terms of trauma of self, community. It shows up in various different ways. How do you navigate this in terms of trying to stay into the coaching space without it drifting into true therapy or something that?
Yeah, well, you do have to tread lightly. I agree. I think one, being curious in the way you're asking the questions, and if you, the coach, feel like you're going down a lane or there's clearly deeper stuff going on, for you to recognize you need to pull back. I've at times helped clients find therapists to help them. But I also want them as a coach to recognize there might be some things around their identity that is not getting in the way, but how they're not leaning into their identities in order to be more successful or achieve the goals they're setting out to be. But it's really, Brian, to get your question, it's not an easy answer. I think you have to navigate with care and recognize when when it's clearly beyond what you can provide them. But I think it's important. One of the questions I sometimes will ask, particularly if I know I'm going to be working with a client from a different identity group, is I have an intake questionnaire, and I sometimes will ask, like, which identities are selling for you? Do you feel like they're important to the work that you're doing? Just so I can have potential exploration. Is it something you want to explore in the coaching session? Things like that. Yeah. So how, for some of you, how is this showing up, or how does this show up in your coaching practice, the stuff we talked about today?
Joel, I was so grateful that you mentioned the biases of the coach because that is something that I always have to kind of check myself on and be reminded of as a member of a marginalized or minoritized group.
Mhm.
My socialization is such that I am aware of and look for biases in other people, in more dominant culture
Mhm.
folks. And
Mhm.
and culture and identity has many, many, many levels and facets. I have a one of my sister's children is gender non-binary.
Mhm. Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so I too have had a different, in education. So gender, there's gender identification, there's class, and so for me, there are things like sometimes I look at another person of color and assume similarities that may not be there.
Mhm. Right. Yeah.
Or however they're presenting, I may assume differences
Mhm. Mhm.
that aren't necessary to remark. Oh,
Yeah.
in my mind, I
Yeah.
mean, mark when
Mhm.
I'm. So I think that that's something. And so how this is showing up for me is a reminder that cultural humility is for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, the title of the book. So I when I do these workshops or I speak, I do just name up front. The title of the book can rub some people the wrong way, right? Like, um, when you write a book, by the way, I would encourage all of you to be authors at some point in your career. It is an awesome, awesome experience. Um, but you have to have a target audience, right? You can't say your book's for everybody because then no one's going to pick it up. In this case, the target audience is white leaders who want to get better at leading diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work, but don't know where to start or are feeling stuck. But every concept in the book is applicable to every person, no matter what their identities are. So when I do workshops, cultural humility workshops, I don't call them Dear White Leader workshops, right? They're cultural humility workshops. And I've presented in front of lots of folks from different cultural backgrounds doing this work with cultural humility. And folks from all different salient with all different salient identities walk away with a lot of things to think about in their own life and how they're showing up in spaces and how maybe their biases have shown up even if they're from a minoritized community, um, particularly as it relates to gender, sexual identity, and those kinds of things. And so it's an important thing. But yes, the title does it is provocative. It's meant to be provocative. It's meant to try to get people to pick up the book virtually and physically to take a look inside to see what's inside. But yeah, what else is happening for people? Can you say again what the fourth L? Oh, so there's three characteristics. It is self-awareness, self-critique, redressing power imbalances, and or systemic change. Those are the three. And it's circular, it's not linear, because it's always going to go back to self-awareness. Because like I shared, society will continue to change, culture will continue to morph, and we have to be nimble. And sometimes it's uncomfortable, right? And the other thing when I do this talk with folks from faith communities, I make it very clear that I'm not telling them they have to change their faith or their values. I'm asking, can you enter into a conversation where you have a willingness to learn so you can walk away with a better understanding, as opposed to just hitting your talking points where you're trying to convince the other. So seeking to understand versus seeking to convince.
Joel, when you were talking about with the slide, you were talking about how to build cultural humility. You
Oh,
had have a growth mindset, develop deep curiosity, develop
and
deep
deep listening.
and that was the last one. There wasn't a fourth.
As there wasn't a fourth one. I talked about so a book that's been really helpful to me is titled Seek, Seek by Scott Shigeoka. Some of you are nodding your heads because you've probably seen it. It's about curiosity, and he talks about the what is it? Detach ourselves from our assumptions, biases, and certainties. It's the dive model. D is for detach. I is for being intentional. V is for seeing the value in everyone or the dignity in everyone. And E is for now the E just escaped me. Yeah, anyways, it's the dive model. And so that has helped me think about how I enter or develop deep curiosity. Yeah. Yeah, great. You all know how to find me if you think of something else, I'm available. Please download my workbook. I think it'll be super helpful for you all as you think about the work that you do as coaches or wherever I know Gianna and Rebecca have the higher ed background. And so this is, some of you else may have higher ed stuff. But this is important work.
Mallory, did you have a question?
Oh, just a gratitude, Joel. Thank you for holding the space and sharing
Yeah.
with us. And this conversation is also helping me realize the importance of a strong network of coaches, because there will be moments where a client brings something where lived experience or those salient identities really are important, and I can refer them to a partner coach. So I appreciate this conversation. And
Yeah.
that's my big takeaway. I also loved the question you bring before every session of what biases might I need to check at the door here. And I wanna try that on this week. So thank you.
Yeah. That's good. Thank you. Glad to hear that it was helpful for you.
And coaches, why don't you unmute and just give Joel your biggest takeaway? What did you get? What did you learn? It's always nice to have some feedback when you're the presenter. Savory, go for it.
I was just going to share that it really resonated with me because I've been a healthcare executive, and as a woman in that type of role, that is not something that's super comfortable. And that phrase that you used, "Oh, I'm sorry you took it that way," that I've heard that a lot. So I really appreciate you saying that. It just spoke to me. I love this topic, and I love the curiosity that we can bring as coaches, not just for our clients and to our clients, but to ourselves on this topic. And so I'm really grateful to have joined tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Savory. Go ahead, Brian.
I think for me, knowing my audience of who I want to coach and who I want to support, I mean, a lot of going into the HR professional. This is super relevant, and it is almost like a competency and a skill set that is very much needed in this craft that is often forgotten. You'd be surprised. And so now I think I'm just about how I can take this information as one more tool in my toolkit to enable better coaching for myself, but also for those that I'm serving.
Right. Thank you.
Joel, I just really appreciate the balance between staying true to your target audience and making it relevant for everybody. That was, really good. And I appreciate your presentation style. Thank you.
I think for me, it was remembering to check those biases. And I think you, Diana, said it when you're like, as a person of color, I make these assumptions that we have these connections, but that's not always true. Everybody's story is different, everybody's experience, and we need to honor those stories and experiences that people are bringing with them too. So.
And I'll jump in here really quickly. So this was great. It definitely reinforced my social work background. So it was super helpful to sort of like refresh most of the content that I learned. But also for me, so I'm a career coach at Stony Brook University. So I'm currently developing or redesigning an unconscious bias in the workshop presentation. So this is definitely helpful for me in terms of coaching the students on how to navigate those types of situations.
Thanks, Jen, for dropping that in the chat.
Yeah. And group, I really appreciate you all showing up, and you're always welcome to come. I host something with business building content or with a guest speaker each first Wednesday of the month from 5 to 6. So feel like you can come, feel like you can bring another coach. And please do get in touch with Joel. You know, he also does team coaching as well to come in and train your team if your team needs it, and to come in there with your executives, because it really does start from the top down in the way that people are treated within organizations. So feel like you can reach out to him. He's very well versed. He speaks everywhere. And if you don't already have a copy of his book, I did drop the link, to Amazon in there. And please make sure that you check out that QR code. Take every free thing he has. I know that I have, and you will be happy that you did.
Yeah. Thank you for being here, and thank you for having me, Gretchen.
Oh, yeah, you got it. And thank you, everybody.